Well, I think in respect to everyone's time, I want to just go ahead and say thank you so much to everyone for joining this evening and for Dr. Heinrich here to be with us to go over deconstructing specific aims. She's a professor of neurological surgery and a senior associate dean for research at OHSU, and also has an entire career spent helping neurosurgeons to get funding and to work through the K12 study section with us over the last, it feels like at least a decade. And I've benefited from her insight. And I think that really she understands well what it's like to be a physician scientist and try to have research funded, and also what it's like for non-physician scientists to read sort of translational grants and basic science grants. So really looking forward to her talk today. And thank you so much for joining us.
Oh yeah, no, it's my pleasure, Melanie. And welcome everyone. Thanks for taking your what is today? Wednesday? Tuesday night to think about specific aims. So as Melanie said, I've been in my primary appointments, been in neurosurgery my entire career. And I've worked with a lot of physician scientists. I've also reviewed a lot of grants. Turns out there's a secret list at NIH that I'm on, which is apparently I've had disproportionate influence on peer review, meaning I've done so many grant reviews, they don't want me to do anymore because they think somehow I've influenced the direction of science. I would say that if I were in charge, things would be different. And I'm not, but nonetheless, I've reviewed a lot of grants. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and should be good. And really, the key thing about your specific aims page, there we go, is don't annoy your reviewers.
Apologies, just so you know, we're seeing the like your view.
Wrong one. Oh, let me see if I can unfix that. Thank you for
It's
telling me.
okay.
Yep. You don't want to look at that. Not that it has anything interesting. All right, now we're in trouble. I can't get it back. Share, stop sharing. Let's try screen 2. How's that look, Sophie?
Perfect.
Okay, all right. So key thing is don't annoy your reviewers. So, you've all probably heard this. The specific aims page is that first real scientific page of your application, and it's the most important page of your application. It's your elevator pitch. You really, by the end of that page, the reviewers have to think that your question is significant. And they also have to believe that you've got a logical and feasible plan for addressing your question. And I'll be honest, by the end of that aims page, most reviewers, and I am certainly one of them, I have a pretty strong sense of what my score is going to be. In fact, I might spend the entire rest of my time while I read that grant mentally trying to justify that score that I've already come to. So people can get they've got a strong opinion about what they're looking at just by the end of that first page. And if you've kind of got off on the wrong foot, it can be really hard to dig your way out of that. So, and I can't see hands or anything, but how many of you have already, that are not faculty, have already written an NIH grant and have done an AIMS page before? Sophie, any hands going up?
Yeah, I see at least 2 so far.
Melanie doesn't count.
She's not.
I've done way too many.
So, whether you've been introduced to it or not, it's a one-page thing. And it, when you sit down to write a grant, it's quite intimidating. You've got that blank piece of paper in front of you or the blank computer screen. But it's actually not as bad as it looks because there's a standard form. There's a formula, and reviewers expect to see things in a certain order. And if you kind of know what the form is, it becomes a heck of a lot easier. And it's kind of like an upside down pyramid stacked on a column. So first you start out, introduce your problem. What's the big problem that you're going to solve? Okay, and we'll go into each of these in more detail. Then, what are you proposing to do to solve that problem? So introduce your problem, propose your solution, and then the actual aims part is how specifically are you going to get there? How are you going to get to your solution? And that's the specific aims. Specifically, how are you going to get there? And then it's usually nice to sum it up and say how you're going to save the universe at the end in a couple of sentences. So let's work through those different components. First is introduce the problem. And usually I think of this as having two parts. What need are you going to address? So it has two parts. What's the health problem? Usually this is one or two sentences stating the general topic, why it's important. This is not like X number of patients a year suffer from this condition. I always find that really annoying. And I especially find it annoying when someone wastes 2 or 3 inches of precious space telling me how many, I'm a pain scientist, and somebody spends 2 or 3 inches explaining to me how many people suffer from pain in the United States. I mean, this grant has come to a pain study section. Every single one of the grants I'm going to review is going to be about pain. And they've wasted a third of a page telling me pain's important. So you need to say, yes, what's important, but it's not a direct function of the number of patients. And, on the other hand, something could be really, really significant if it's a small number of people, but it's truly devastating. So don't spend a lot of time on X number of patients have this. That just kind of, to me, misses the point. Okay, so you've got the health problem. You've also got the science problem. What do we already know? Okay, so that's kind of the background, the literature, briefly. What's the state of current knowledge? But what do we want to know? What do we need to know? What key information is missing? What are the barriers to advancing the field that you're interested in? What happens if we don't do what you're proposing here? And so this is not a situation where you want to say something like, X is unknown, therefore we need to do more research. I'm sort of like, well, maybe it's unknown because it's not important. You need to be actually much more tied to what you're trying to propose. What's the key information that's missing that would help advance the field? The fact that we just don't know something, X is not known, that's not significant. So be really careful about sort of saying what the key information that's missing that would help us advance the field. Okay, not just there's a piece of information that's not there, so I'm going to get that piece of information because nobody's done it yet. Again, maybe nobody did it because nobody cares. Okay. Then this is where it's getting meaty. Propose your solution. The goal of the proposal, so you can say something like the overall goal of this proposal is to solve the problem you just outlined. Okay. And then you say, and in this particular application, this is what I'm going to do. And this should be clear, measurable endpoints. Things like, I'm going to test this. I'm going to identify X. I'm going to quantify why. This is what I'm going to do here. And that's going to lead to your central hypothesis. Usually you're going to outline a rationale for that hypothesis. Maybe it's your preliminary data, maybe it's the literature, maybe you're just going to make an argument. But this central hypothesis is what sets up your aims. So you're going to start out at a high level. What's the long-term overarching goal? What's the big problem that ultimately we need to solve, that NIH wants to solve? Then what's your objective with this application? And then what's your hypothesis? And that's then set you up for your actual aims. Okay, this is how you're going to test your central hypothesis, which you just stated. And the way, there's people will frame each aim in various ways. Usually there's 2 to 4 aims. A way I like to do it, one way is just have like a headline. So establish how circuit A talks to circuit B, and then have a working hypothesis or a little approach. So something like determine how circuit A talks to circuit B, period. That's your headline. And then you could say, using single unit recording and a combination of calcium imaging and optogenetics, I am going to test the hypothesis that this particular molecular class of neurons activates a certain output, something like that. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is just to say, aim 1, test the hypothesis that. And then you say, using, again, at a high level, your methods, I will do this. So you want to give some idea of what you're going to do, what you're going to measure, but don't go into a lot of experimental details. I don't want to, as a reader, I don't want to come to the end of the page and think, I really wonder how they're going to get there. But at the same time, if the whole thing has just been experimental detail and I'm drowning in it and I don't really know how it relates to the significance and where they're going to be at the end, I don't like that either. So it's a kind of there's a fine line there. There's a balance between letting the reviewer kind of in general know how you're going to do this, but not so much experimental detail that they think you can't see the forest for the trees. Now, there's all sorts of advice about how the aims should relate to each other. Well, they should be related to each other, but not too much. So if they're too independent, they can criticize you on the grounds that, well, if aim 1 doesn't work, then aim 2 is going to be useless, and therefore they're too independent and they don't like you. They shouldn't be merely descriptive, typically. You should probably, again, be having things like, I'm going to test, I'm going to identify, I'm going to quantify. And I think most importantly for junior faculty who haven't done this before, they shouldn't be too ambitious. And I think Melanie would totally agree with me. If you think about the number 1 criticism that comes up for relatively junior investigators, it's that the proposal's too ambitious. And I think a lot of times people are trying to show how much work they've done. And frankly, nobody cares. That's not what they're interested in. They want to know, can you plausibly do what you propose to do and answer the question you want to answer? And if you throw everything but the kitchen sink in there because you want to prove that you're going to work really hard, they're going to criticize it as too ambitious. So I can think of maybe 2 grants over the course of my reviewing career where I was like, wow, this grant's thin on the ground. They don't have any ideas. There's not enough meat here. On the other hand, there have been a lot of grants that I've criticized or someone else has criticized as being too ambitious. So to give you an example, oh, and then you should wrap it up. So at the very end, I usually have like 2 sentences at the most that give a high-level description of the expected outcome, what we will know by the end, and how it will advance the field. So it kind of looks like this. So here's an example specific aims page. I'm sure it's too small for you to read. I can barely read it myself, but there's a few things to notice. First of all, can you please put margins on your grant? I know people want to move, make the margins as small as possible. You're better off, reviewers will hate you less if you leave a little white space. And it'd be better to, think hard and focus your writing than say, oh, but I need every possible square inch of space to be filled with text. There's also, you should have space between your paragraphs. Give them a little white space. They will thank you. So here you go. The first paragraph, I set up the health, in this example, we set up the health problem, the scientific problem. This one's about pain. And so what we're interested in here is descending control. So we say, impaired descending control has been documented in all sorts of pain problems. And we're interested in understanding how they're modulated by analgesic drugs. So then we go into the next paragraph is what do we know already? And then the third paragraph is what we want to know. The proposed studies. We'll focus on this identified synapse. And we're going to use key techniques in vivo single-cell recording. We're going to use optogenetic manipulation. We're going to use slice recording. And at the end, we say these recordings will determine what we want to know. And then we jump right into the aims. We will address 3 specific aims. So one is using, in this case, I've sort of say, we're taking the hypothesis approach. So like aim 1 is using in vivo recording from identified RBM neurons, determine whether there are novel inputs. And then the second one is using another method, identify the membrane mechanism. And the third is using in vitro electrophysiology, define membrane mechanisms. So in this case, it's kind of, I've given you a hint of what the method is, and then here's the hypothesis. And then finally, sum up the impact, better understanding of molecular, cellular, and circuit level mechanisms that underline pain is essential for better treatments. I never promise I'm going to cure pain, by the way, never do that because you're not. And then say how what we're going to do is going to get us there. So, a couple of pieces of advice. Have some pity on your reviewers. Here's a reviewer. They have a stack of grants to review that's about 10 inches tall. And whoever this PI was, actually, I know who this PI was. They have no white space between paragraphs. The margins are as small as margins can be. And I have to read this thing, and I hate them already. So don't do this. Leave some white space. Realize that, they've got better things to do than be reading your grant, and they're reading your grant for you. So have some pity. Tell a story. Don't let reviewers make up their own story. I'm trying to think of an example here, but if you start saying you're going to investigate a certain circuit, and you kind of introduce an idea and leave it dangling out there, and the reviewers are going to be thinking, well, what about this other alternative hypothesis that you're not talking about? If you don't make your story so crisp and clear and just keeps them reading so they never start thinking on their own, they'll make up their own story. And then when you don't do their story, they're going to score your grant poorly. So keep your story so crisp, so clear, so holding their attention, that they don't start thinking on their own. Because if they think on your own, it won't serve you well. Okay, when you talk about impact, it's scientific impact. How will your work advance the field? And finally, don't set up expectations if you aren't going there. For example, if you're not testing a new therapeutic target, don't talk about new therapeutics in your impact statement. People make promises. If they make a promise on that aims page, I expect them to fulfill it. And when they don't, I get mad. So, tell your story, make sure that they don't think of their own story for you, and don't set up expectations for things you're not going to do. So I think that's it. So I really learned to sort of spend a little more time answering questions. So open for questions. Fun.
Thank you, Dr. Hanker. That was awesome. I have a couple of quick questions actually about the format. First, and I think this has been addressed several times, but I don't know if there's a consensus in terms of having references in the specific aims page. And the second question was whether or not an impact statement is necessary or advised or not.
Okay, so references, I get annoyed when there aren't references. I think you're right, though, there's no consensus. I think some people believe that there should not be references. I personally start getting annoyed when somebody makes a claim and I'm like, well, what literature are they talking about? So I always put them in. But there is a sort of a format thing I meant to mention. It used to be that you could put a figure on the aims page. And that would often be very helpful. Like I used to make figures, it'd be like I'd have a circuit, and then I would have little arrows like aim 1 is going to test this connection, and aim 2 will test, that next connection. You can't put figures on your aim page anymore because apparently the software that NIH is using to sort of categorize grants and grant topics and what have you can't handle figures. And they just want the aims page with no figures. So if it makes sense and it's going to help your story to have kind of a summary diagram that shows your circuit or whatever it is, I always try to stick it right early in the introduction so I can refer to it without actually having it on the aims page. Because it's really frustrating to not be able to put it there. A picture's worth 1,000 words, but unfortunately, you don't get to have that picture anymore. So the second question was impact statement. Help me understand what do you mean by an impact statement?
Like the significance, the impact of this research and sort of like a broad overview. I know we introduced the topic in the first few paragraphs, but I've seen some grants with specific aims where once you've introduced the aims, you sort of summarize again with an impact statement saying that if we prove these aims, this is going to be the impact on the field, like the broader impact on the field.
Yeah, so that's, that was kind of one of my last slides on the thing. I think you should have a summary. I think you should wrap it up. I think there should be like a short 3 sentences, no more, at the bottom that pulls it back together, pulls it all together, right? Give us a high level description of what we're going to know when this work is completed, how it's going to advance the field. I think it just really helps reviewers if you pull it all back together at the end. I know sometimes people don't do that. I have a sense, though, they're not doing it more because they're worried about space. They don't have space, and I think you'd be better off honing your story, having a very crisp logical flow so that you have room to pull it all together at the end. That'd be my recommendation. There's no rule that says you have to have one or not, but I think it's a good idea.
Got it. Thanks a lot. Yeah, that's very helpful.
Melanie, Langston, anybody want to jump in on that? I usually look for that. I think it helps.
Yeah, Mary, I agree with you. This is Seppi and Jenny.
Hi,
So
Debbie.
yeah, hey, I really agree with you that, and maybe I'll just take a moment to kind of or overemphasize some of the things you showed and said, and maybe get your take on another element of it. I think what you brought up about formatting. I mean, people think that that's just, aesthetics. It doesn't matter. It matters. It really matters, and it gives a sense of if you paid attention and taken the time to do what Mary said, which is to create some white space. I think there's different schools of thought on use of things like italics and bolding and underlining. I think you can go too far with it. Like I'm a bit of a fan of doing it very strategically, but you don't want to have so much that's underlined or bolded that italics is that you can't, like you choose the thing that you want to use and use that. Don't use all modalities of emphasis, so to speak. And then the one other component, which I don't think you said explicitly, Mary, but as I was zooming in on those aims, which I assume were your own aims, right?
Yeah, I
That
didn't
you
want to
showed.
embarrass anybody else.
Yeah. So about that background section, and I saw it in your aims. I think it's a really good place to also, and I'm sorry if I missed it, you saying it, Mary, but pulling in your preliminary contributions in that space, right? So you're kind of setting up not just the overall background of the problem, but the thing you have done in that overall background. And so you're kind of essentially doing a mini grant in one page. Like you're having your significance, your prelim data, in as much as you can work it into that background. And then you're going to your approach and things like that. So I think in my mind, I think of the specific aims as having to be a mini grant. Like it's the one page version of the entire grant, right? It's really not just aims.
Oh,
So
yeah, no,
yeah.
definitely. And in fact, if I can actually see the text, it's pretty tiny, but there was a place where I said over the last several decades, the Heinricher lab, and then sort of laid that out. And then as I got to the what we want to know, I was using some specific preliminary data. Often, when you think about the rationale for your central hypothesis, you know, I would say 9 times out of 10, that's going to be in part based on your preliminary data, right? So you have to bring in your preliminary data at that point, or what you as a scientist have already done. So that is almost always part of the rationale for what, your hypothesis didn't spring, from your forehead. Usually you have some preliminary data that sends you towards one line of investigation, and that's it would definitely go there. But on the formatting, there was had a neurosurgery resident one time who had he had me and another mentor, and the other mentor was one of these people that would like italicize and then underline the italicized stuff, and then bold half of it, and I would be like, pick one, italicize, bold, or underline, but never do two at the same time. And poor Dominic would go back and forth between me and the other mentor. And finally, I'm like, what is your system? Have a system, like your key, use the bold for the key idea, and then use italic for the conclusion, or what is your system? He said, I have no system. You go in and you take it all out, and then Nabil puts most of it back in, and then you take some out, and I figure whatever's left over must be important. It's just, I would have a system, have a hierarchy, use bold for a certain level. If you want to use bold, use italics for a certain level. Never do two things simultaneously. don't torture your text. Again, reviewers, if everything's italicized, nothing's italicized. And it's just hard to read. So pick what you want to emphasize. The other thing people worry about, oh, I only have 2 aims. You know what? It's okay. There's no rule that it has to be 3. If you have 5, though, people will be starting to look at you. 4's a lot. 5 would be like, this person is clueless. And again, that's part of the overambitious issue.
And Mary, what's your view on sub aims? We do see that a fair bit sometimes too.
I think it depends on the kind of, there are types of work or types of project where it makes sense. Like you might be, a lot of times it's it helps the reviewer in terms of organization, right? Like I'm gonna do this in a tissue culture and then I'm gonna do the complementary thing in vivo. And so 1A is first I do it in tissue culture and 1B is then I do it in whole animal. That's, if it helps organize your story, I'm all for it. It's all about clarity. It's more important to be clear than to follow some artificial rule. And then give it to people that, are not in your field. Because if it isn't helping clarify the story for them, they'll tell you. And the other piece is, you know what, write your aim. They always tell you to write your aims first. And then when you go and write your actual grant, you'll realize you will have to go back. It's going to be iterative, right? You think you're going to do a certain set of experiments. You write your aims, and then you get down to aim 2, and you realize, oh, my preliminary data doesn't really fit with that, or oh my gosh, I can't quite do it like that. So then you have to go back, revise the aims again, because now you've thought about it. And it should be iterative, back and forth between the aims and the actual grant. All right, I see something in the chat.
Yeah, I can read it. It's from Trevor. If there's a part of the story that obviously seems important, for example, scRNA sequencing, but your lab has no capacity to do so, do you leave it off the grant or do you find a collaborator and add that in?
Well, you mentioned a method. I don't know if that's necessarily an aim, but so if you really think a particular piece of evidence is going to be critical, whether we call it a name or what, it's good to have a collaborator, but this is, and other faculty jump in, this can be a double-edged sword, right? If you say, I'm going to collaborate with so-and-so who I've no history with, is 1,000 miles away, and there's no established track record of collaboration, it can hurt you. So that you have to kind of think really hard about how to thread that needle. Does that help or make it worse? If everybody keeps saying, what about? Yeah, that's probably a good hint. Because that's an example of people are, they're telling the story. And evidently your story's not tight enough without that way of thinking. So, this is why you need to start preparing the grant early enough that you can maybe identify a collaborator, at the very least, get them, to work on a little preliminary data with you, even if you don't have a publication date together. If that person has actually provided some of the preliminary data, that would help. It's a balance. But if everybody's telling you that, yeah, I think you need to do something about it.
I'll give a second to see if there are any other questions, but our next session, just so everyone knows, will be on June 16th, and Dr. Bill Mack will give a talk on preparing for a career as a neurosurgeon scientist at that time.
That's a high level topic.
Any other questions for Dr. Heinricher? If not, we can call it, give everyone 20 minutes back, which I'm sure everyone appreciates, but I think this has been really helpful and informative. So thank you so much, Dr. Heinricher, and everyone.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Night.
Thanks, Mary. Good night.
Bye.